Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera had always dreamed of owning a piece of land where he could raise horses and maybe start a small cattle operation after his military service ended. When he found the perfect 15-acre ranch on the outskirts of Pinewood Valley, Texas, it seemed like destiny calling his name. The property sat beautifully among rolling hills, with a modest farmhouse, a red barn that had seen better days, and enough pasture land to make his dreams come true. Marcus had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and was preparing for his 4th deployment. When he made the purchase in 2019, the ranch cost him nearly every penny of his savings, plus a substantial loan, but he believed it was worth the investment. His wife Sarah was initially hesitant about taking on such a large financial commitment, especially with Marcus heading overseas again, but she could see the joy in his eyes whenever he talked about their future on the ranch. What Marcus didn't fully understand at the time was that the ranch sat within the boundaries of the newly formed Pinewood Valley Homeowners Association. The HOA had been established just 2 years earlier, when a large residential development called Meadowbrook Estates was built nearby. The developers had drawn the HOA boundaries to include not just their new subdivision, but also several existing properties in the area, including Marcus's ranch. During the purchase process, Marcus's real estate agent mentioned the HOA in passing, but the focus was primarily on the land itself, the water rights, and the condition of the structures. The HOA documents were buried in a stack of paperwork that seemed endless. Like many buyers, Marcus trusted his agent and lawyer to handle the details while he focused on his upcoming deployment and the logistics of moving his family. Sarah tried to read through all the documents, but between caring for their 2 young children and preparing for Marcus's departure, she found herself overwhelmed by the legal language and technical terms. The HOA dues seemed reasonable at $85 per month, and the restrictions appeared to be standard language about maintaining property values and community standards. The ranch became their sanctuary during the few months before Marcus's deployment. They spent weekends repairing fence lines, painting the barn, and planning where they would eventually build a proper stable. Their children, Emma and Jake, loved feeding the chickens they had bought and exploring every corner of their new property. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was building something permanent, something that would be there for his family long after his military career ended. When deployment day arrived in March 2020, Marcus felt confident leaving his family in their new home. Sarah had quit her job to focus on managing the ranch and homeschooling the children, which meant they were living entirely on Marcus's military salary. But they had calculated that the budget would work. The HOA dues were automatically deducted from their bank account each month, and Sarah made sure to keep the property neat and well maintained. From Afghanistan, Marcus would video call his family every few days, and Sarah would walk around the property with her phone, showing him how the garden was growing or how the barn repairs were progressing. These calls became the highlight of his deployment, giving him something positive to focus on during the long, difficult months overseas. However, what Marcus and Sarah didn't realize was that the Pinewood Valley HOA was undergoing significant changes. The original board members, who had been relatively lenient with rural properties like theirs, were being replaced by new residents from the Meadowbrook Estates development. These new board members had very different ideas about what their community should look like. The new HOA president, Janet Morrison, was a retired corporate executive who had moved to Pinewood Valley, seeking a perfectly manicured suburban lifestyle. She viewed the existing rural properties, including Marcus's ranch, as obstacles to achieving her vision of a pristine residential community. Janet believed that properties like the Rivera Ranch brought down property values for the newer homes in Meadowbrook Estates. By late 2020, the new HOA board began implementing stricter enforcement of community standards. They hired a management company called Premier Community Services to handle day-to-day operations and enforcement activities. This management company was known for aggressive tactics in ensuring compliance with HOA rules and had a reputation for maximizing fee collection through fines and legal action. Sarah began receiving violation notices in early 2021, starting with complaints about the appearance of their barn, which the HOA claimed was inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. The notices demanded that the barn be painted in approved colors and that certain unsightly farm equipment be removed from view. Each violation notice came with a fine of $50 per day until the issue was resolved. Sarah tried to comply with the demands, spending money they didn't have on paint and trying to relocate equipment to less visible areas of the property. But the violation notices kept coming. The HOA complained about their chicken coop, their vegetable garden, the temporary fencing they had installed, and even the gravel driveway that had existed since before the HOA was formed. When Sarah called the HOA management company to discuss the violations, she was told that rural activities were no longer permitted within the community boundaries, and that they needed to bring their property into compliance with suburban residential standards. The monthly fines were accumulating quickly, and Sarah found herself spending most of Marcus's deployment dealing with HOA disputes instead of enjoying their dream property. By the summer of 2021, Sarah was receiving multiple violation notices every week. The HOA had hired an enforcement officer who would drive by their property daily, photographing anything that could be considered a violation. Sarah felt like she was living under constant surveillance, and the stress was beginning to affect her health and her ability to care for Emma and Jake. The fines had grown to over $3,000, which was money the family simply didn't have. Marcus was still deployed in Afghanistan, and international phone calls were difficult and expensive. When Sarah finally managed to reach him during one of his brief periods of communication, she broke down crying as she explained what was happening at home. Marcus was furious but felt completely helpless being thousands of miles away. He tried calling the HOA management company from overseas, but the time difference and poor connection quality made meaningful conversation nearly impossible. When he did get through, the representatives were dismissive and insisted that the violations were legitimate and the fines were accumulating according to the community bylaws that he had agreed to when purchasing the property. The situation escalated when the HOA demanded that Sarah remove all farm animals from the property within 30 days. They claimed that livestock was prohibited under the community's updated covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which had been amended after Marcus purchased the property. Sarah explained that they had bought the ranch specifically for agricultural purposes and that removing the animals would defeat the entire purpose of their investment. Janet Morrison, the HOA president, scheduled a hearing to address the Rivera family's multiple violations. Sarah attended the meeting at the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center, feeling intimidated by the formal setting and the hostile attitudes of the board members. She brought photographs showing how well maintained their property was, and letters from neighbors who supported their right to continue farming activities. During the hearing, Sarah explained that her husband was serving overseas and that they had purchased the property in good faith, believing they had the right to use it for agricultural purposes. She showed the board their original purchase documents and property deed, which clearly indicated the land's agricultural zoning and water rights for livestock. The board members were unmoved by her presentation. Janet Morrison stated that the community had evolved since the Rivera family's purchase, and that agricultural activities were no longer compatible with the residential character they were trying to maintain. She explained that property values in Meadowbrook Estates were suffering because potential buyers were deterred by the sight of farm animals and rural activities nearby. The board voted unanimously to uphold all violations and assessed additional fines for failure to maintain community standards and refusing to comply with lawful HOA directives. They gave Sarah 60 days to bring the property into full compliance or face legal action that could result in foreclosure proceedings. Sarah left the meeting, feeling defeated and overwhelmed. She had never imagined that owning property could become such a nightmare, especially while her husband was risking his life serving their country. The legal language in the violation notices was confusing, and she couldn't afford to hire an attorney to help her understand her rights. Meanwhile, Marcus was dealing with increasingly dangerous conditions in Afghanistan. His unit was involved in the final phases of the American withdrawal, which was chaotic and emotionally exhausting. The last thing he needed was to worry about losing his family's home while he was trying to focus on keeping himself and his soldiers alive. Sarah tried to comply with some of the HOA demands by rehoming their chickens and goats, which broke the children's hearts. Emma and Jake couldn't understand why they had to give away their pets, and Sarah struggled to explain the situation in terms they could comprehend. The stress of the ongoing conflict was affecting the entire family's well-being. The HOA continued to find new violations even after Sarah made changes to the property. They complained about the color of their mailbox, the height of their grass, the placement of their trash cans, and dozens of other minor issues that seemed designed to harass rather than improve the community. Each violation came with additional fines, and the total amount owed was approaching $8,000. In September 2021, Sarah received a certified letter informing her that the HOA was placing a lien on their property for unpaid fines and fees. The letter explained that if the debt wasn't resolved within 90 days, they would begin foreclosure proceedings to recover the money owed to the homeowners association. Sarah finally managed to contact a military legal assistance attorney who explained that the Service Members Civil Relief Act should provide some protection against foreclosure while Marcus was deployed. However, the attorney also warned that HOA liens were often upheld by courts, especially when homeowners had signed agreements acknowledging the association's authority. The stress of the situation was becoming unbearable for Sarah. She was losing weight, having trouble sleeping, and struggling to maintain a positive attitude for her children. The ranch that was supposed to be their dream home had become a source of constant anxiety and financial strain. Marcus made the difficult decision to request emergency leave to return home and deal with the HOA crisis. However, his commanding officer explained that the military withdrawal from Afghanistan was at a critical stage, and emergency leave could only be granted for life-threatening family emergencies. An HOA dispute, while serious, didn't qualify under military regulations. By October 2021, the total amount owed to the HOA had grown to nearly $12,000 when late fees, legal costs, and administrative charges were included. Sarah received another certified letter stating that foreclosure proceedings would begin in 30 days if the debt wasn't paid in full. In November 2021, the HOA officially began foreclosure proceedings against the Rivera family's ranch. The legal documents were filled with complex language that Sarah couldn't fully understand, but the message was clear: pay the full amount owed immediately or lose their home. The foreclosure notice was posted on their front door for all the neighbors to see, which embarrassed Sarah and confused her children. Sarah desperately tried to negotiate with the HOA management company, explaining that her husband would be returning from deployment soon, and they would be able to address the situation properly once he was home. She offered to set up a payment plan to gradually pay off the accumulated fines, but Premier Community Services refused any compromise. They insisted that the full amount must be paid within the legal time frame or the foreclosure would proceed. The local newspaper, the Pinewood Valley Herald, picked up the story when a neighbor tipped off a reporter about the situation. The article, titled "Military Family Faces Foreclosure While Father Serves Overseas," brought attention to the Rivera family's plight and sparked controversy in the community. Many longtime residents were shocked to learn about the aggressive tactics being used by their HOA. However, the new residents of Meadowbrook Estates largely supported the HOA's actions. They had paid premium prices for their homes based on promises of a well-maintained community with strict standards. They argued that exceptions couldn't be made based on personal circumstances, as this would set a dangerous precedent that could undermine property values for everyone. Marcus finally returned from his deployment in December 2021, just weeks before the scheduled foreclosure auction. He was exhausted from months of combat stress and struggling to readjust to civilian life, but he immediately threw himself into fighting for their home. What he discovered about the HOA's actions during his absence left him shocked and angry. The HOA had not only accumulated fines for alleged violations, but had also charged the Rivera family for legal fees, administrative costs, and collection expenses that nearly doubled the original debt. Marcus learned that the management company received a percentage of all fines collected, which created a financial incentive to maximize violations and penalties. Marcus attended his first HOA board meeting in January 2022, wearing his military dress uniform to make a statement about his service to the country. He presented documentation showing that many of the violations were for activities that had been occurring on the property since before the HOA was established. He argued that retroactive enforcement of new rules was unfair and potentially illegal. Janet Morrison and the other board members were unmoved by Marcus's presentation. They insisted that all property owners were subject to current community standards, regardless of when they purchased their homes or what activities had previously been allowed. They claimed that the HOA had the legal authority to modify and enforce community rules as they saw fit. The meeting became heated when Marcus pointed out that he had been defending American freedoms overseas while the HOA was trampling on his family's property rights at home. Several board members took offense at the implication that their actions were unpatriotic, and Janet Morrison threatened to have Marcus removed from the meeting for disruptive behavior. Marcus hired an attorney specializing in HOA disputes, but the legal fees quickly consumed what little savings they had left. The attorney explained that Texas law generally favored HOAs in these types of disputes, especially when property owners had signed documents acknowledging the association's authority. However, he believed they might have grounds to challenge some of the fines based on the timing and retroactive enforcement of rules. The legal battle dragged on for months while the family lived under the constant threat of losing their home. Marcus struggled with depression and anxiety, which were common among veterans returning from combat, and the ongoing stress of the HOA dispute made his adjustment even more difficult. He had nightmares about losing everything he had worked for while serving his country overseas. Sarah homeschooled Emma and Jake in an atmosphere of uncertainty, never knowing from day to day whether they would still have a home next week. The children sensed their parents' stress and began acting out in various ways. Emma, who was 8 years old, started having trouble sleeping and would ask repeatedly whether they were going to have to move away from their ranch. The story gained more media attention when a veterans advocacy group called Veterans Property Rights learned about the case. They organized a protest outside the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center during a HOA board meeting, carrying signs that read, "Support our troops and stop HOA abuse." The protest drew dozens of participants, including other veterans who had faced similar problems with homeowners associations. The media coverage put pressure on local politicians to address the issue. State Representative Tom Bradley, himself a military veteran, called for a review of HOA practices that targeted military families. He introduced legislation that would provide additional protections for deployed service members facing HOA actions. But the bill faced opposition from real estate industry groups. In July 2022, the judge handling the foreclosure case ruled in favor of the HOA, finding that the association had followed proper legal procedures and that the fines were legitimately assessed according to the community's governing documents. The judge expressed sympathy for the Rivera family's situation, but stated that military service, while honorable, did not exempt property owners from HOA obligations. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for August 15, 2022. Marcus and Sarah had exhausted their savings, borrowed money from family members, and even set up a crowdfunding page, but they were still several $1,000s short of the amount needed to stop the foreclosure. They began making plans to move their family into a small apartment and start over from scratch. 3 days before the scheduled auction, Marcus received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The caller identified himself as Colonel James Mitchell from the Army's Office of General Counsel, and he had some very interesting questions about the Pinewood Valley HOA's actions against a deployed soldier's family. Colonel Mitchell explained that the Army had been monitoring the Rivera case through media reports and veterans advocacy groups. The military had a vested interest in protecting service members from predatory practices that could affect morale and readiness. He informed Marcus that a preliminary investigation had revealed some concerning information about the Pinewood Valley HOA and its management company. The Army's legal team had discovered that Premier Community Services was owned by a larger corporation that had been under federal investigation for fraudulent billing practices in government contracts. More importantly, they found evidence that the HOA's enforcement actions against the Rivera family may have violated federal laws protecting deployed service members, including the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Colonel Mitchell arranged for Marcus to meet with a team of military attorneys who specialized in protecting service members' rights. These attorneys had resources and authority that private lawyers couldn't match, and they were motivated by a mission to ensure that American soldiers weren't victimized while serving their country overseas. The military legal team immediately filed motions to halt the foreclosure proceedings, citing multiple violations of federal law. They argued that the HOA had deliberately targeted the Rivera family while Marcus was deployed, knowing that he couldn't effectively defend his property rights from Afghanistan. They also raised questions about the legitimacy of many fines that were assessed for activities that predated the HOA's establishment. Meanwhile, The Army's Criminal Investigation Division began looking into the financial practices of both the HOA and Premier Community Services. They discovered a pattern of excessive fines and questionable fees that suggested the management company was using aggressive tactics to generate revenue rather than legitimately maintaining community standards. The investigation revealed that Janet Morrison had a financial relationship with Premier Community Services that she had not disclosed to other HOA members. Her husband's construction company had received several lucrative contracts to perform maintenance work in the Meadowbrook Estates development, creating a potential conflict of interest in the HOA's decision-making. Federal investigators also discovered that the HOA's legal fees were being inflated through a scheme where Premier Community Services would refer cases to a specific law firm that would then kick back a portion of their fees to the management company. This practice was not only unethical but potentially illegal under state and federal regulations governing HOA operations. The military's involvement in the case attracted significant media attention across Texas and beyond. The story was picked up by national news outlets, and the Rivera family found themselves at the center of a broader debate about HOA abuses and military families' rights. Veterans organizations from across the country began expressing support for the family and calling for reforms to protect service members. As the investigation expanded, other military families in the Pinewood Valley area came forward with similar stories of HOA harassment and excessive fines. The pattern that emerged suggested a systematic targeting of military families, possibly because they were often deployed and unable to immediately respond to HOA demands. The Texas Attorney General's office announced that it was opening its own investigation into HOA practices statewide, using the Rivera case as a starting point. Attorney General Sarah Martinez stated that protecting military families from predatory practices was a priority for her office, and she promised aggressive prosecution of any violations of state or federal law. In September 2022, federal authorities executed search warrants at the offices of Premier Community Services and several associated businesses. They seized computers, financial records, and communication files as part of their expanding investigation into HOA management fraud. The raids were covered extensively by local television stations, bringing even more attention to the Rivera family's case. The HOA Board of Pinewood Valley called an emergency meeting to address the federal investigation and the negative publicity surrounding their community. Many residents were shocked to learn about the extent of the accusations against their management company and the potential legal liabilities facing the association. Several board members, including Janet Morrison, resigned their positions as the pressure mounted. New board members were elected, who promised to take a more reasonable approach to community management and to cooperate fully with federal investigators. They immediately terminated the association's contract with Premier Community Services and hired a new management company with a better reputation. The new HOA leadership reached out to Marcus and Sarah to discuss resolving their case amicably. They offered to waive all outstanding fines and legal fees in exchange for the family dropping their federal lawsuit against the association. However, Marcus's military attorneys advised him that accepting such a settlement might interfere with the ongoing criminal investigation. The Department of Justice announced in October 2022 that it was filing federal charges against the executives of Premier Community Services for wire fraud, mail fraud, and violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. The indictment alleged a conspiracy to defraud military families and other HOA members through excessive fees and fraudulent billing practices. The federal charges sent shockwaves through the HOA management industry nationwide. Industry associations rushed to implement new ethical guidelines and training programs to prevent similar scandals. Many states began reviewing their laws governing HOA operations and considering stronger protections for military, families, and other vulnerable homeowners. Marcus and Sarah watched these developments with a mixture of relief and amazement. What had started as a local dispute over chicken coops and barn paint had evolved into a federal case that was changing laws and industry practices across the country. Their personal nightmare was becoming a catalyst for protecting other military families from similar abuse. However, the Rivera family's ordeal was far from over. While the federal investigation had stopped the foreclosure proceedings, They were still living with uncertainty about their future and dealing with the emotional trauma of nearly losing their home while Marcus was serving overseas. The federal investigation into Premier Community Services expanded rapidly as investigators discovered evidence of fraud affecting dozens of HOA communities across Texas and neighboring states. The Department of Justice estimated that hundreds of military families and thousands of civilian homeowners had been victimized by the company's fraudulent practices over several years. In November 2022, the military took an unprecedented step that shocked the HOA industry nationwide. Under authority granted by federal laws protecting military installations and personnel, the Department of Defense announced that it was taking temporary control of the entire Pinewood Valley community to ensure that military families' rights were protected during the ongoing investigation. The military action was based on a rarely used provision of federal law that allows the government to intervene in civilian communities when actions against military personnel threaten national security interests. Colonel Mitchell explained that the systematic harassment of military families could affect recruitment and retention, making it a matter of national security. Federal marshals arrived in Pinewood Valley on a Tuesday morning in November, serving legal papers on the HOA board and establishing a temporary military administration office in the community center. Signs were posted throughout the neighborhood, announcing that the community was under federal oversight until further notice. Many residents of Meadowbrook estates were outraged by what they saw as government overreach. They had paid premium prices for homes in a community with strict standards, and they feared that military control would lead to a decline in property values and community appearance. Several residents organized protests and hired attorneys to challenge the federal takeover. However, longtime residents of the area, including many who had been subjected to excessive HOA fines and harassment, welcomed the military intervention. They saw it as their only hope for relief from what they described as tyrannical HOA practices that had made their lives miserable for years. The military administration immediately suspended all pending HOA violations and fines throughout the community. They established a review process to examine every violation issued over the previous 3 years, with particular attention to cases involving military families. Many fines were found to be excessive, duplicative, or based on newly invented rules that had no legitimate basis. Marcus and Sarah were among the first families to have their cases reviewed by the military administration. A team of Army attorneys and civilian experts examined every violation notice the family had received, comparing them to the original HOA governing documents and state laws. They concluded that more than 80% of the fines had been improperly assessed. The military review process revealed systematic problems with how the HOA had been managed under Premier Community Services. Violation notices were often issued for minor issues that should have been handled with friendly reminders. Fines were assessed immediately without giving homeowners reasonable time to address problems. Legal fees were inflated through kickback. Schemes with preferred law firms. Colonel Mitchell held regular town hall meetings to keep community residents informed about the military administration's findings and plans. He explained that the goal was not to permanently control a civilian community, but to restore lawful and fair governance that protected all residents' rights, especially those of military families. The military administration brought in experts on HOA law and community management to establish new policies and procedures. They created an appeals process for disputed violations, established reasonable timelines for addressing legitimate issues, and implemented oversight mechanisms to prevent future abuses. They also required that all HOA communications be written in plain English that ordinary homeowners could understand. Federal prosecutors announced additional charges against Janet Morrison and other former HOA board members in December 2022. They were accused of conspiracy to commit fraud and abuse of authority in connection with their roles in the excessive fining scheme. Morrison's undisclosed financial relationships with Premier Community Services formed the basis for several of the charges. The trial of Premier Community Services executives began in early 2023 and attracted national media attention. Testimony revealed the extent of the company's fraudulent practices and their specific targeting of military families who couldn't immediately respond to HOA demands while deployed overseas. The case became a symbol of corporate greed preying on American service members. Marcus was called to testify at the federal trial, describing how the HOA harassment had affected his family while he was serving in Afghanistan. His testimony was powerful and emotional, bringing several jurors to tears as he described the stress of worrying about losing his home while trying to focus on dangerous military operations overseas. Sarah also testified about the impact the HOA dispute had on their children and family life. She described how Emma and Jake had been forced to give up their beloved farm animals and live in constant fear of losing their home. Her testimony highlighted how HOA abuses affected entire families, not just the targeted homeowners. The defense attorneys for Premier Community Services argued that their clients had been following standard industry practices and that the Rivera family's problems were the result of their failure to comply with legitimate community standards. However, the evidence of fraudulent billing and excessive fines was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for only 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. The executives of Premier Community Services were sentenced to significant prison terms and ordered to pay millions of dollars in restitution to affected homeowners. The judge stated that their targeting of military families while they served overseas was particularly egregious and warranted enhanced punishment under federal sentencing guidelines. Meanwhile, the military administration in Pinewood Valley was preparing to transition control back to civilian governance. They had spent months training new HOA board members and establishing policies designed to prevent future abuses. The new system included mandatory training for board members, regular financial audits, and a resident ombudsman to handle complaints. The Rivera family's ordeal had lasted more than 2 years and had taken a significant toll on their health, finances, and emotional well-being. However, they had also become symbols of resistance against HOA abuse and advocates for military families' rights. Their case had led to changes in laws and industry practices that would protect thousands of other families from similar experiences. In March 2023, the military administration formally returned control of Pinewood Valley to civilian governance, but with strict federal oversight that would continue for 3 years. The new HOA board, elected with strong community support, immediately voted to officially apologize to the Rivera family and other residents who had been victimized by the previous administration's abusive practices. The apology came with more than words. The new board approved a financial settlement that compensated the Rivera family for all the illegal fines they had been charged, plus additional money for legal fees, emotional distress, and property improvements they had been forced to make under the previous regime's demands. The settlement totaled nearly $75,000, which allowed Marcus and Sarah to finally feel secure about their ranch's future. Marcus and Sarah used part of the settlement money to make improvements to their property that they had always wanted but couldn't afford during their legal battle. They built a proper stable for the horses they planned to buy, expanded their vegetable garden, and renovated the old barn that had started their whole ordeal with the HOA. This time, they painted it any color they wanted without asking anyone's permission. The changes in Pinewood Valley extended far beyond the Rivera family's property. The new HOA board eliminated most of the restrictive rules that had been used to harass rural property owners. They established reasonable maintenance standards that focused on genuine health and safety issues rather than cosmetic preferences. Monthly HOA dues were reduced by 40%. After the elimination of excessive management fees and legal costs, Emma and Jake were finally able to get new farm animals to replace the ones they had been forced to give up during the HOA crisis. They chose goats this time, and Marcus built them a playground that included climbing structures and plenty of space to roam. The children's joy in having their pets back helped heal some of the emotional wounds from their years of uncertainty and fear. The federal investigation's impact extended far beyond Pinewood Valley. Congressional hearings were held to examine HOA abuses nationwide, with Marcus and Sarah invited to testify before the House Veterans Affairs Committee. Their testimony led to new federal legislation, called the Military Family Property Protection Act, which provided stronger safeguards for service members facing HOA actions while deployed. The new law required HOAs to follow special procedures when taking action against military families, including mandatory mediation before foreclosure proceedings could begin. It also established federal funding for legal assistance programs to help military families fight abusive HOA practices. Veterans organizations praised the legislation as a significant step forward in protecting service. Members' rights. Premier Community Services was forced into bankruptcy as a result of the criminal convictions and civil lawsuits filed by affected homeowners. The company's assets were liquidated, and the proceeds were distributed to victims of their fraudulent practices. This sent a strong message to the HOA management industry that targeting military families would face serious consequences. Janet Morrison and the other former board members, who were convicted of conspiracy charges, served prison sentences ranging from 18 months to 4 years. Morrison's conviction was particularly significant because she had been seen as a respectable community leader, showing that HOA corruption could occur at any level of society. The Pinewood Valley case became a textbook example in law schools and business schools across the country. It demonstrated how unchecked authority in HOAs could lead to serious abuses and showed the importance of proper oversight and accountability in community governance. Many HOA management companies revised their practices to avoid similar problems. Marcus decided to leave active military service in 2024, having served for 15 years and completed multiple deployments. He wanted to focus on his family and their ranch, and he had developed a passion for advocating on behalf of other military families facing similar challenges. The stress of the HOA battle had convinced him that life was too short to spend away from the people and place he loved most. Sarah started a support group for families who had experienced HOA abuse, meeting monthly at the Pinewood Valley Community Center that had once been the scene of their worst experiences with the previous board. The group provided emotional support and practical advice for people dealing with HOA disputes, and it became a model for similar organizations in other communities. The Rivera Ranch became a symbol of resistance against corporate greed and government overreach. Marcus and Sarah regularly hosted visitors from other communities facing similar problems, sharing their story and offering encouragement to families who felt overwhelmed by powerful HOA organizations. Their experience showed that ordinary families could fight back against institutional abuse and win. Marcus and Sarah often reflected on how their worst nightmare had ultimately led to positive changes that would help thousands of other families. While they would never choose to go through the experience again, they were proud that their struggle had made a difference for other military families and HOA members across the country. The ranch that had once been threatened with foreclosure became a thriving small farm where Emma and Jake grew up with a deep appreciation for the land, animals, and the freedoms that their father had fought to defend overseas and at home. The red barn that had started their HOA troubles now stood as a symbol of their victory over those who had tried to take away their dreams. On quiet evenings, Marcus would walk around his property and remember the dark days when he thought he might lose everything while serving his country in Afghanistan. Now, watching his children play in the yard and his wife tending her garden, he knew that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in defense of home and family against those who would abuse their power to harm honest, hard-working Americans. The Pinewood Valley HOA still exists today, but it operates under the reformed principles established during the military administration. Property values in the community have actually increased since the abusive practices were eliminated, proving that reasonable governance benefits everyone. Most importantly, military families in the area now know they have protection and support if they ever face similar challenges while serving their country overseas.